A teenage girl sits quietly on a plane, lost in her book. Moments later, a man beside her leans in, not to talk, but to pour hot coffee all over her without warning. Why? Because of the color of her skin. What he doesn't know is this: her father isn't just any dad. He's the CEO of the very airline they're flying. What happens next flips the entire flight upside down. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just expose hate. It delivers karma at 35,000 feet. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss powerful, real-life stories that hit deeper than headlines. Ebony Marie Carter stood in the bustling terminal of John F. Kennedy International Airport, brimming with excitement. It was the kind of excitement that made her feet tap and her heart race. At 16 years old, she was used to flying, but this journey felt more significant. This time, she was traveling alone, without her father's watchful eye hovering over her every move. Her mother had passed away when Ebony was barely 4, leaving her and her father, James Carter, to navigate life together. He was her rock, her guiding light, and perhaps to the envy of every business school graduate, the CEO of American Airlines. Most people who saw Ebony only noticed the cheerful teen, her curly hair pinned up in a simple style, her bright smile hinting at an unbreakable optimism. If they knew who her father was, they rarely put two and two together. After all, Ebony loved the anonymity. It let her see the world in an unfiltered light, free from the suffocating sense of entitlement or fear that often accompanied high-profile backgrounds, and it gave her the chance to experience life just like any other teenage girl with big dreams. Today, Ebony was heading from New York to Los Angeles for a weekend leadership conference organized by a renowned nonprofit. She was thrilled not just about the panels and workshops, but about meeting other young leaders. She wasn't traveling in first class either. She wanted to be among everyday people, to learn from them and see the world beyond the lens of corporate privilege. Slinging a backpack over her shoulders, Ebony made her way through the terminal with determined steps. The mesmerizing array of travelers, from families hauling giant suitcases to businessmen tapping away at laptops, never ceased to captivate her. She stopped by a small bookstore, flipping through pages of a travel magazine that showcased breathtaking images of the California coast. She wondered if she'd have time to dip her toes in the Pacific Ocean once she arrived. She checked her watch, still half an hour until boarding. Ebony tucked the magazine away, deciding instead to grab a bottled water. Her father, James, had planned to accompany her on the trip, but as CEOs often do, he'd been called into an impromptu meeting and promised he'd catch the next flight out. Ebony, fiercely independent, insisted that she'd be fine traveling solo. Though a pang of disappointment lingered, she had hoped her father might get a chance to see the Los Angeles sunshine with her. Ebony also felt a surge of pride that he trusted her enough to do this alone. An announcement crackled through the loudspeakers, calling for passengers of American Airlines Flight 291 to begin boarding. Ebony inhaled deeply, relishing the familiar thrill of an upcoming takeoff. Little did she know that this flight, so seemingly routine, would become the catalyst for a whirlwind of emotion, conflict, and a dose of karmic retribution that no one on board would ever forget. Ebony's life had never been typical. As the daughter of James Carter, she lived in a world of boardrooms and business deals, but she also valued ordinary experiences, like joining her high school's debate club and volunteering at a local animal shelter. From the outside, many might assume she was spoiled, but Ebony was grounded by her father's values. James Carter started his career as a flight attendant in his early 20s, hustling his way through night school while studying aviation management. Not born with a silver spoon, he grew up in a modest neighborhood in Chicago where crime rates and broken promises were all too common. Seeing enough hardships, James vowed to change his trajectory. Through endless determination, he climbed the corporate ladder, a flight attendant to a regional manager, then on to an executive role, and eventually into the CEO chair of American Airlines. He poured his heart into forging a more inclusive company culture, never forgetting where he came from, and never forgetting that empathy was the core of leadership. Ebony's mother, Miranda, was a historian who specialized in African American studies. Her untimely passing left an indelible hole in Ebony's life. But through her memories and her father's stories, Ebony understood the richness of her heritage and the battles fought by generations before her. This awareness fortified her sense of identity. She learned that love and compassion weren't just words but lived experiences, mirrors reflecting how one should treat others. When Ebony was younger, she often traveled with James. Whether to London, Tokyo, or Sydney, she observed how he interacted with everyone, from the cleaning staff to fellow executives, with equal warmth. She saw that leadership at its best was about humility and responsibility to others. It inspired her to strive for greatness, not for self-glorification, but for community upliftment. In school, Ebony excelled academically and participated in multiple extracurriculars. She was known for her voice in social justice debates, rallying classmates to stand up against bullying. She felt compelled to continue her mother's legacy of seeking historical truths and pushing for equality. Perhaps because her father had never shielded her from reality, never told her the world was perfect. She understood that prejudice was still a stubborn thorn in society's side. Still, Ebony tried to remain optimistic. Most of her experiences traveling were positive, filled with friendly faces, interesting conversations, and the sweet rush of exploring somewhere new. The thought of encountering blatant racism on a flight was rarely on her mind, especially not in the 21st century. Sure, she'd heard stories, read the news, but she believed times were evolving. People were learning. Society was progressing. Unfortunately, Ebony would soon face a jarring reminder that progress is never linear. Sometimes ignorance shows up in unexpected places, lashing out when you least expect it. And this flight to Los Angeles was about to reveal that the demons of hatred can lurk even in the most mundane moments, requiring courage and unity to confront them. As Ebony stepped onto the jet bridge leading to the Boeing 777 bound for Los Angeles, a calm settled in her chest. She'd always loved the immediate hush that fell once she left the noisy terminal and walked the narrow gangway. It felt like being on the threshold of a new adventure, the final step before lifting off into possibility. The flight attendants at the door greeted her with wide smiles. She smiled back, handing over her boarding pass. Neither they nor the gate agent had any clue who she was or who her father was. Ebony's seat was in premium economy, still comfortable enough but not the extravagance of first class. She found her row with ease, row 17, window seat. The aisle seat next to her was still empty. Overhead bins were quickly filling up, so she efficiently stowed her backpack. From her vantage point by the window, Ebony observed the stream of passengers shuffling down the aisle. A young couple with a toddler cradled between them looked exhausted, but relieved to find their seats. Two elderly friends joked about the weight of their carry-ons. A businessman barked instructions into his phone, eyebrows furrowed in perpetual stress. It was a typical flight scene, a cross-section of humanity compressed into a metal tube for a few hours. While Ebony was scrolling through her phone, she felt someone nudge the seat behind her as they tried to store their bag. She glanced back and offered a courteous smile. There was no tension in the air, just the usual mild chaos of passengers trying to settle in. A sense of normalcy enveloped her, and she settled into her seat, pulling out a book about civil rights activists her mother had once recommended. She hoped to finish at least a few chapters before they landed. A faint beep from the intercom signaled the pilot's introduction. He welcomed everyone aboard American Airlines Flight 291, promising a smooth journey of just under 6 hours. Ebony let the pilot's words wash over her as she gently closed her eyes, leaning back against the headrest. The cabin door closed and the plane began to push back from the gate. Ebony felt the familiar jolt of anticipation. Soon the engines roared to life, and the plane taxied to the runway. From her window, she spotted the labyrinth of airport lights gradually thinning out. Finally, the aircraft's nose tilted upward, merging with the wide open sky. As they broke through the cloud layer, Ebony felt a flutter in her stomach. She stole a glance at the seat next to her. No one had arrived to occupy it yet, which was unusual. But then again, flights had last-minute seat changes all the time. Maybe someone would show up after takeoff. She shrugged, returning to her book, unaware of the storm of hatred and bigotry that was about to converge on her tranquil bubble of peace. The seat beside Ebony remained empty for a good 20 minutes after takeoff. She occasionally glanced at it, wondering if someone had missed the flight or moved seats. She found it peculiar but didn't give it too much thought. Then, halfway through the flight attendant's first round of drink service, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She looked up and saw a man in his mid-50s, a scowl carved into his lined face. His hair was neatly combed, parted with precision, and he wore a crisp polo shirt tucked into expensive-looking khakis. He was clutching a coffee cup, and his knuckles were nearly white from the tight grip. He pointed at the aisle seat. "I believe that's my seat," he said in a voice dripping with impatience. Ebony noticed that the flight attendants had moved on to the next row, leaving a momentary lull around them. "Oh, sorry about that," Ebony said politely, unfastening her seatbelt. She scooted out of her seat to let him in. "Thought you weren't coming." The man didn't respond. He shoved past her, nearly knocking her shoulder with his elbow. Ebony frowned, but she tried to brush it off. People had bad days, she reasoned. After she settled back in, she noticed the man's rigid posture and the sharp angles of his eyes as he examined her from head to toe. She couldn't tell if he was upset about his seat or simply disliked the idea of sharing space. She attempted a friendly smile. "Long day?" she asked, hoping to break the ice. He grunted in response and looked away, taking a long sip from his coffee. Ebony tried not to stare, but there was a tension emanating from him, thick enough to cut with a knife. She fiddled with the corner of her book, feeling unease stir in her stomach. Perhaps some people just preferred silence, she told herself, and she returned to reading. But the man's restlessness was palpable. His foot tapped incessantly against the floor. Every time a flight attendant walked by, he seemed to glare at them with barely concealed disdain. Ebony forced herself to ignore the negativity, focusing instead on the words on the page in front of her. She immersed herself in the stories of brave activists who had faced hate with unwavering resolve. Despite her attempts at calm, Ebony could feel the man's gaze darting in her direction intermittently. It was the kind of stare that made her skin crawl, like he was searching for something to disapprove of, something to criticize. She wanted to think it was her imagination, but every now and then her eyes would flick up, catching his in a withering glare that spoke volumes. She tried to breathe, focusing on a strategy to diffuse tension if it ever escalated. Growing up with a father who advocated peaceful conflict resolution, Ebony believed in empathy, but she also knew how quickly bigotry could rear its ugly head. She'd faced subtle microaggressions before, but never had she been trapped at 35,000 feet with someone who radiated such open hostility. Little did she know that her instincts were about to be proven right. This man's prejudices were simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest spark to erupt into a blaze of confrontation, one that would shatter the illusion of a calm mid-flight cruise. About an hour into the flight, Ebony's ears popped as the plane hit some mild turbulence. The seatbelt sign came on with a metallic ding, and the pilot's voice advised everyone to remain seated. Flight attendants hurried to secure their carts, cups of soda trembling precariously. Ebony reflexively clasped the armrests, waiting for the rough patch to pass. The man beside her muttered something inaudible under his breath. Then suddenly the plane dipped slightly. He braced his cup against the tray table. Ebony tensed, hoping the turbulence would fade quickly. She managed to calm herself, turning a page in her book, but her shoulders stayed taut. When the plane stabilized, the man let out a disgruntled sigh. "Took them long enough," he grumbled, as if the flight crew controlled the weather. Ebony kept her eyes on her pages, deciding not to engage. The flight attendant came by to check on them. "Everything okay here?" she asked kindly. The man waved her off. "Just some turbulence," he said curtly. Ebony flashed a brief smile to the flight attendant, who moved on down the aisle. She tried to refocus on her book. The stories of civil rights leaders marching for equality felt almost too real in that moment, as her seatmate exuded hostility. As if on cue, she felt his stare again. He cleared his throat. "How old are you?" he asked abruptly. Ebony looked up. 16, she answered carefully, her heart quickening. He snorted. "Traveling alone, I presume?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." His lips curled into a sneer. "I don't understand why they let children occupy premium seats," he said, tilting his coffee cup. "Must be some new affirmative action perk, huh?" Time seemed to slow. Ebony felt her pulse throb in her ears. Part of her wanted to believe she had misheard, but the words were unmistakable. She steadied her voice. "I'm here because I paid for my ticket," she said calmly. "I'm not sure I follow what you mean." His eyes narrowed. They let anyone with a sob story or a certain skin color get extra privileges these days, he growled. "I've worked hard my entire life, and I still had to pay full price." He shook his head, as though Ebony's presence itself was an affront to him. A wave of nausea and disbelief crashed over Ebony. She tried to respond with composure. "Sir, I paid for my seat just like you did." He scoffed. "Sure you did." Before Ebony could gather her thoughts to say anything else, he leaned forward, eyes blazing with a venom she'd never encountered in person. Then, with shocking speed, he lifted his coffee cup and tilted it, letting the dark, lukewarm liquid splash onto Ebony's shirt, drenching her book and the seat's armrest. Ebony gasped, the heat from the liquid making her flinch. The smell of coffee overpowered her senses. Stunned silence gripped her chest. For a split second, she couldn't process what had just happened. The cabin seemed to freeze, at least in her mind. Passengers nearby turned in alarm at her yelp. A flight attendant rushed to the scene, eyes wide. Ebony's breath came in ragged gulps, tears pricking her eyes. She felt humiliated, violated. She'd heard of hateful acts before, but to experience such a blatant display of racism firsthand. The man just smirked. "Think twice next time," he muttered, before wiping a stray drop of coffee from his own sleeve. Chaos descended upon row 17 almost instantly. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began murmuring in outrage. A young woman in the row across stood up, phone in hand, ready to record. Others craned their necks to see if Ebony was all right. The flight attendant who rushed over, her name tag read Marisol, looked shocked. She immediately pulled out a handful of napkins to help Ebony dab the coffee off her soaked shirt. "Are you okay, honey?" Marisol asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ebony swallowed hard, trying to steady her trembling hands. It's just coffee," she managed, although the sting of humiliation was far worse than the lukewarm spill. Marisol turned sharply to the man. "Sir, what is the meaning of this? You can't just pour coffee on someone." He shrugged with contempt. "It was an accident," he said, but his tone was anything but apologetic. "She jerked the seat and I spilled. Her fault, if anything." "She didn't move," the woman who had stood up said, phone still pointed at him. "We all saw what happened." Several other passengers chimed in with agreements, shaking their heads in disbelief. The man's face tightened with annoyance, but he seemed unconcerned about the scrutiny. Marisol looked stricken, torn between consoling Ebony and addressing the unruly passenger. She pressed the call button on her intercom, requesting backup from another flight attendant. Moments later, a tall male flight attendant named Eric arrived, also looking stunned when he saw Ebony's stained clothes and the trembling in her shoulders. "Sir, I'll need to ask you to step to the back of the plane with me to discuss this," Eric said, an attempt at polite firmness. The man rolled his eyes. "Why? It was an accident. If this teenage girl wants to dramatize it, that's her business." He remained seated, crossing his arms in defiance. A murmur rippled through the cabin. People were visibly disturbed, some openly glaring at him. Others were offering Ebony comforting looks or softly saying words of encouragement. Ebony felt both exposed and supported at the same time. She wanted to shrink into herself, but she also felt a simmering anger. How could someone act so callously? Eric's posture straightened. "Sir, it's airline policy to address passenger disruptions immediately. If you refuse, we may have to take further action when we land." Even though Ebony's shirt was soaked and her book ruined, a sense of relief washed over her as she saw the flight attendant standing by her side. The man, though, just huffed. "Fine, let's go," he snapped, carefully setting his empty cup in the holder. He slid out of his seat, brushing past Ebony without a glance. Before following Eric, Marisol put a gentle hand on Ebony's arm. "I'm so sorry this happened. Let me see if I can find you a change of clothes from our cabin supplies, and we'll move you to another seat if you like." Ebony bit her lip, nodding. Despite her shock, she could only manage a quiet, "Thank you." The flight attendant's kindness was a small balm in that moment, but she still felt her heartbeat slam against her ribcage. She wondered if she should call her father, or if he was even available. Her mind spun with confusion and hurt. She took a deep, shaky breath. This wasn't just a spill of coffee. It was a direct act of hate, a reminder that racism lived on in pockets of everyday life. And with every passenger's eyes on her, Ebony felt both the weight of expectation and the hope that some kind of justice would be served. Unbeknownst to Ebony, at that very moment, her father, James Carter, was making his way to the front of the plane from first class. A last-minute schedule change had allowed him to catch Flight 291, just as he'd promised. He'd hoped to surprise Ebony, but upon boarding he discovered the cabin was full, and he had to use his own standby perks to get a single seat in first. He'd figured he would meet her after landing, or perhaps the flight attendants might arrange a quick reunion mid-flight. But as he walked down the aisle, he immediately sensed something off. Passengers were whispering, voices charged with tension. He saw a flight attendant leading a man, a passenger wearing a sour expression, toward the back galley. The passenger was muttering curses under his breath. James paused, his eyes catching sight of a commotion around row 17. People were clustered there. He recognized Ebony's backpack and could see her curly hair and the coffee-stained seat. A jolt of alarm surged through him. He quickened his pace. The moment Ebony spotted her father, tears she'd been holding back threatened to spill. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking with relief and lingering shock. James shot forward, practically vaulting over a couple of carry-on bags in the aisle. "Ebony, sweetheart, what happened?" His gaze swept over her soaked shirt, the coffee dripping onto the seat. She tried to speak, but the words stuck. Instead, she collapsed into his arms, the wave of relief crashing into her all at once. She couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her lips. No matter how composed she tried to be, seeing her father's face brought down the floodgates of emotion. Marisol, who was rummaging through a small supply kit, looked up. Realization dawned on her face. This was James Carter, CEO of American Airlines, the man whose portrait she'd seen in the airline's corporate newsletters and whose speeches she'd admired for their emphasis on empathy and leadership. "Mr. Carter," she began, voice trembling, "I had no idea you were on this flight. Your daughter was attacked. A passenger deliberately spilled coffee on her." James's eyes flared with concern and anger. He held Ebony closer, feeling her tremors against him. "Attacked?" he echoed, confusion and outrage mingling in his voice. He stroked Ebony's hair gently, as though to reassure her. "Are you okay, baby?" She swallowed, taking a moment to compose herself. I'm okay," she whispered, though her tone said otherwise. "That man, he said awful things. Then he dumped his coffee on me." James's jaw tensed, lines of fury etching across his usually composed features. "Where is he now?" he asked, looking to Marisol. She gestured to the back. Eric took him to the galley. James nodded, helping Ebony into a standing position. Another flight attendant arrived, handing Ebony a spare shirt from an emergency kit they kept on board. She thanked them quietly, stepping into the aisle to change in the nearby lavatory. James gave her a gentle pat on the back as she walked away, heart aching to see his daughter traumatized. He turned to Marisol. "I need to speak to the passenger, but first, please contact the captain. Let him know that this is an extremely serious matter. Possible hate crime. Definitely assault. We will not allow such behavior on our flights." Marisol nodded, picking up the intercom. Meanwhile, James inhaled deeply, trying to quell the tempest of anger swirling inside him. The father in him wanted to drag the offender off the plane at once, but the CEO in him knew he had to handle this systematically, ensuring the man faced proper consequences. Yet, he couldn't deny the primal urge to protect Ebony with every fiber of his being. As the plane cruised through the skies, an invisible spark of tension had turned the flight into a microcosm of justice and accountability. In just a few minutes, James Carter would come face to face with the man who thought he could spill hate and coffee on a young girl without repercussion. And James had no intention of letting him walk away without learning a harsh lesson in humility. James made his way down the aisle toward the back galley, passing passengers who eyed him with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Some recognized him as the CEO of the airline. Others simply saw a father determined to stand up for his daughter. Either way, a hush of respect followed in his wake. When he reached the galley, Eric was standing guard, arms folded, blocking the man from returning to his seat. The man looked impatient, shifting from foot to foot like a cornered animal. He glanced at James, not immediately recognizing who he was. Instead, he saw only Ebony's father, bristling with anger. "You must be the girl's father," the man said, voice tinged with scorn. "Well, maybe you ought to teach her some manners about not moving the seat so abruptly." James's eyes blazed. "Don't you dare talk to me about my daughter's manners after you assaulted her." He took a step forward, forcing the man to back up against the galley counter. "You deliberately poured coffee on a 16-year-old child. Do you realize how vile that is?" The man rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, it's just coffee. She was fine. You people always—" James's hand shot up. "Stop. Right there," he commanded, voice low and dangerous. "I will not tolerate one more hateful word out of your mouth. We have witnesses who saw your accident. We have people who heard the slurs you spat at her." Eric placed a steady hand on James's shoulder, a silent reminder to remain calm. James inhaled sharply, reining in his fury. He remembered his responsibilities as both a father and a leader. "I'm going to lay this out for you," James said, his tone measured but firm. "You committed an act of assault and hate. We will be reporting you to the authorities the moment we land." For a moment, the man's bravado faltered. A flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. "Authorities?" he repeated. "For spilling coffee?" James held his gaze. "For assaulting a minor and for possible hate crimes. American Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for racism and violence on board. You'll be met by law enforcement upon arrival in Los Angeles. And considering I'm the CEO of this airline, you can guarantee we'll be pursuing a lifetime ban for your behavior." That last piece of information sank in hard. The man's face contorted with sudden realization. "You're the— No, this is ridiculous. You can't ban me over a misunderstanding. This was an accident." Eric cleared his throat. "Sir, we have multiple passengers who witnessed you verbally abusing Miss Carter and then intentionally dumping your coffee on her. This wasn't an accident." With that, the man's anger rose again, fueled by desperation. "You can't do this. I have rights. This is discrimination against me." His voice grew louder, attracting stares from nearby rows. James raised an eyebrow at the irony. "Discrimination? You poured coffee on my daughter and made racist remarks. You lost the privilege of flying with our airline the moment you decided to assault one of our passengers." His words had a finality to them that seemed to deflate the man, but in the man's eyes, anger still simmered, his jaw clenched tight. Before he could retort, James stepped back, turning to Eric. "Have the pilot radio ahead to the authorities in Los Angeles. This passenger will not be allowed to leave without meeting them first." Eric nodded, ushering the man to a seat near the back, far from Ebony. The man grumbled but complied, aware that his attempts to storm back to his original seat would be futile. He sat there, a portrait of sullen resentment, cornered by his own actions. James exhaled, relief and adrenaline coursing through him. He walked back toward the middle of the plane where Ebony was now seated in a row by herself, wearing a clean shirt provided by the crew. Her eyes were still red, but her posture was straighter, her composure returning. The ordeal wasn't over, but at least for now, she was safe. As he approached her, James knew that while he'd handled the immediate threat, the emotional damage was already done. Ebony had faced bigotry in a way that no child should ever have to, and though he couldn't erase what had happened, he intended to make sure this man answered for his hatred, and that the world learned from this dark moment. After the confrontation, the atmosphere in the cabin remained uneasy. Word spread quickly that the CEO of American Airlines was on board, and that his daughter had been attacked. Some passengers were outraged, discussing the incident in hushed but impassioned tones. A few, emboldened by the presence of a camera phone culture, whispered about having recorded part of the ordeal and capturing the man's racist remarks. Meanwhile, Ebony sat quietly in her new seat, a blanket draped over her lap. James sat beside her, holding her hand. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The silent companionship was a balm, a shared moment of vulnerability between father and daughter. Finally, James broke the silence. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said, voice cracking with genuine remorse. "I wish I'd been there sooner." Ebony stared at her fingers intertwined with his, tears welling up. "It's not your fault, Dad," she whispered. "Some people are just hateful." He gently squeezed her hand. "I know. But I always promised I'd protect you." His voice was thick with emotion. "Seeing you like that, it tore me apart." She gazed out the window, the endless expanse of sky seeming both beautiful and indifferent. "I'm okay," she repeated, as much to convince herself as him. "Just shaken. He said such vile things, as if I didn't even deserve a seat here. And then he actually poured coffee on me." James's lips pursed in anger. "I've seen a lot in my life, Ebony, but never ever has someone dared to do that so openly in front of others. His hate is his own burden, not yours." Ebony nodded, the weight of the incident still settling in. "Thank you for handling it," she said softly. I'm glad you were here." James placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. "We're going to make sure he faces consequences. I promise." Down the aisle, Marisol walked up, offering Ebony a warm cup of tea. "Something soothing," she said. "I'm really sorry you had to experience that." Ebony forced a small smile, accepting the cup. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate it." Marisol nodded. "The captain has radioed ahead. We'll be met by airport security and LAPD at the gate. And Mr. Carter, the pilot also wants to extend his apologies and let you know if there's anything you need. Just ask." James thanked her, appreciating the crew's support. As Marisol walked away, Ebony exhaled slowly, trying to process everything that had unfolded in such a short time. One minute she was reading a book about civil rights activism. The next she was living in a moment that felt plucked from history's ugliest chapters. Despite her shock, a spark of resilience ignited in Ebony's chest. She thought of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and her own mother's teachings about facing racism head-on with dignity. This was her reality now, an unwanted but potent reminder that prejudice still existed. And though it hurt, Ebony resolved not to let it define her or overshadow the goodness in her life. James, sensing her inner turmoil, pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "We'll get through this," he said softly, "and we'll make sure the world hears about it. Maybe it'll encourage others to stand up." Ebony looked up, meeting his eyes. She nodded, and in that unspoken exchange, father and daughter fortified one another. There would be fallout and media attention, to be sure, but for now, Ebony clung to the solace of her father's presence and the knowledge that she was never alone in the fight against hate. The flight continued, the inevitable lull of cruising altitude returning. But for Ebony and James, their hearts still pounded with adrenaline. The turbulence outside had passed, but inside the emotional storm lingered. Just as Ebony was beginning to drift off, exhausted by the ordeal, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She blinked awake to find the young woman who had recorded the incident standing in the aisle, her phone in hand. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said softly, her eyes full of empathy. I just wanted you to know that I captured his hateful remarks on video, in case you need it later. Ebony sat up straighter, relief and gratitude washing over her. Thank you, she replied. That could be really helpful. James also offered the woman a kind smile. We appreciate you stepping up, he said. It takes courage to get involved. The woman nodded. People need to see this stuff still happens. I can send it to you if you like. James and Ebony exchanged glances. Yes, James answered. Please do. He handed over a business card with his airline email. We'll need all the evidence we can gather. Thank you again. With a respectful nod, the woman returned to her seat. Ebony felt her chest lighten a little. Having tangible proof meant there would be less room for doubt about what had transpired. Not long after, another surprise awaited them. A flight attendant approached with a phone in hand. She leaned down to James, whispering, Sir, it's the captain on the line. He'd like to speak with you. James took the phone, puzzled. Captain, this is James, he said. Mr. Carter, the captain's voice crackled through. I just received a call from our operations office. The story is already making waves on social media. Some passenger must have uploaded footage mid-flight. The news desks are picking it up, both the assault and the fact you're on board. James closed his eyes, letting out a quiet sigh. I see. Well, it was bound to happen. I just want you to know, the captain continued, the entire crew is with you on this. We'll coordinate with ground staff for security upon arrival. And we're sorry your daughter had to experience this. James felt a wave of gratitude. Thank you, Captain. Let's proceed as we've planned. We'll let law enforcement handle it once we land. Ebony overheard bits of the conversation, and her pulse quickened. She'd never been the center of a public controversy before, at least not one she'd chosen. The idea of going viral for such a painful experience was daunting. Still, a part of her realized that exposing this man's actions might bring greater awareness to the issue of racism that still simmered beneath society's veneer. When James handed the phone back to the flight attendant, he pulled Ebony into a gentle side hug. News is picking it up, he said softly. I know that might be scary, but you don't have to talk to anyone unless you want to. She took a shaky breath, steeling herself. Maybe I should, she said. Maybe it'll help someone else going through the same thing. James nodded, pride shining in his eyes. That's your decision, sweetheart. I'll support you either way. They stayed like that for a moment, father and daughter united against the storm. Outside the windows, the California coastline was beginning to come into view, an endless tapestry of sun-kissed landscapes. Ebony realized that, ironically, she'd be landing in Los Angeles for a leadership conference, only to find herself suddenly thrust into an unexpected role of advocacy and leadership on a stage far larger than she'd anticipated. The captain announced their initial descent into Los Angeles, advising everyone to bring their seats and tray tables back to their upright positions. Normally, this was Ebony's favorite part of the flight. She'd press her nose against the window, marveling at the sprawling city below, imagining the exciting possibilities that awaited. This time, however, her stomach twisted in knots of anticipation and anxiety. Police officers, media, and social media frenzy would be waiting at the gate. In the rear of the plane, the man who had poured coffee on Ebony sat quietly, flanked by flight attendants ensuring he didn't cause any more trouble. His eyes were downcast, occasionally flicking around to see if people were still glaring at him, which they were. Whatever bravado he'd displayed earlier had waned under the realization that the CEO of the airline, law enforcement, and the internet were not on his side. James, meanwhile, was on his phone, having temporarily connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi to coordinate with American Airlines ground staff. He was texting his assistant, who informed him that local news outlets had picked up the story. Some were already calling it a horrifying display of racism in the skies. Statements were being prepared. James quickly typed back a message. Let's wait until Ebony and I land and can provide direct input before any final statement is released. Next to him, Ebony took deep breaths, trying to quell the nervous energy building within her. She could almost feel the collective tension of the cabin. Most of the passengers had gone quiet, aware that something significant awaited them upon arrival. A few rows ahead, the woman who had recorded the incident gave Ebony a supportive nod. Others offered encouraging smiles. Despite the day's ugliness, Ebony felt a surge of gratitude for the kindness of strangers. It reminded her that one hateful individual did not define humanity. The plane's wheels touched down on the runway, the familiar thump-thump jarring Ebony back to reality. She glanced at James, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Over the intercom, the captain welcomed everyone to Los Angeles, noting that authorities would be assisting with a situation on board and that passengers should remain seated until asked to disembark. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Ebony's heart pounded. She braced herself for the inevitable confrontation with the cameras, the officers, and the stunned onlookers. She reminded herself of her mother's spirit, an unwavering advocate for truth and dignity. Ebony decided she would face this moment with as much grace as she could muster. Finally, the plane came to a complete stop. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Flight attendants positioned themselves in the aisle, gently guiding passengers to remain in their seats for a moment. 2 uniformed officers boarded first, followed by a man in a neat suit, likely an airline official. They made their way to the back where the offending passenger sat. From where she sat, Ebony couldn't see the man's face clearly, but she heard the rustle of handcuffs and the authoritative tone of the officers. Tension coiled in her gut, followed by a peculiar sense of relief. Justice, or at least a semblance of it, was happening in real time. Within minutes, the officers led the man off the plane, accompanied by the flight attendants who would give statements. As he passed Ebony, he avoided eye contact. Whether out of shame or anger, she couldn't tell, but he looked smaller than before, his arrogance drained away. James exhaled, watching the scene with grim satisfaction. Then he turned to Ebony. "Let's go," he said softly. "We'll talk to the officers, file our statements, and then we'll figure out the rest." Ebony nodded, steeling herself. As she stood, a few passengers quietly applauded or said words of support. Ebony felt their warmth flood into her, mitigating the sting of what she'd endured. She stepped off the plane hand in hand with her father, uncertain of what lay ahead but determined to stand tall. Stepping into the jet bridge, Ebony was greeted by the flashing lights of cameras and the echo of hushed voices. A small group of journalists had gathered, their lenses focused on the arriving passengers. Security personnel guided Ebony and James to a discreet area near the gate, where a pair of LAPD officers waited with calm professionalism. Behind them, the man who had attacked Ebony was already surrounded by uniformed officers. He looked increasingly agitated, gesticulating as though trying to argue his way out of culpability. But his words found no sympathetic ears. An airline representative stood by, recounting the flight attendants' accounts of the incident. There was also mention of the video footage posted online. Once Ebony and James approached, an officer named Detective Harris stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, Miss Carter, I'm Detective Harris with the LAPD. We understand there was an assault on the flight." James took a measured breath. "Yes," he confirmed, his arm protectively around Ebony. "He poured coffee on my daughter after making several racist comments." Ebony nodded, her voice still shaky. He called me names and insinuated I shouldn't be in premium seating because I'm black." The detective's jaw tightened. "We take these kinds of hate incidents seriously, Miss Carter. With your statements and the testimonies of other passengers, and especially if we have video evidence, we have a solid case." James nodded. "We intend to press charges," he said resolutely. "I don't want this swept under the rug." The airline representative, a woman named Catherine, stepped in. "Mr. Carter, I'm here on behalf of American Airlines. We fully support you in pressing charges. We've also placed this individual on a no-fly list with our airline, effective immediately." Hearing this, the man exploded in a burst of outrage, his voice carrying across the gate area. "You can't do that. You're all ganging up on me. I have a right to travel. This is a setup." The detective raised a hand to silence him. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent." which I suggest you exercise if you don't want to worsen your situation." A ripple of approval passed among onlookers. A few passers-by even paused to see what the commotion was about. Security quickly cordoned off the area, allowing Ebony and James some semblance of privacy to finish their statements. As Ebony spoke about the man's hate-filled words, tears pricked at her eyes again. She tried to stay composed, to convey every detail accurately. The detective listened sympathetically, occasionally glancing back at the man, whose face grew paler by the minute. The weight of the law was bearing down on him, and karma, in the form of public accountability, was hitting hard. Once the official statements were filed, Ebony and James stepped away to catch their breath. Catherine informed them that the airline had arranged a private car to take them to their hotel. She also mentioned that the press was requesting a brief comment, though there was no obligation to comply. Ebony glanced at her father. "I'll say something," she decided. "I don't want to hide. People need to know that this kind of behavior is still happening, and that it's not okay." James squeezed her hand, pride shining in his eyes. "If that's what you want, I'll support you." He then paused, offering her a wry smile. "I'll handle any corporate statements, but your voice is your own." Ebony nodded, steadying herself. Her heart still felt bruised, but she knew the moment demanded bravery. The man who drenched her in coffee was now facing immediate repercussions, a direct result of his own actions. And while it couldn't erase the trauma he inflicted, watching his hateful world unravel in front of him was a reminder that bigotry wouldn't go unchecked. Ebony stood near the gate area, heart thudding in her chest, as a short row of reporters and cameras waited beyond the security cordon. There was an otherworldly hush in the air, the kind that preludes a moment you know will follow you for the rest of your life. At 16, she never imagined she would be at the center of such a public uproar. Just hours ago, she was a quiet, eager teenager flipping through a book on civil rights in her airplane seat. Now, she found herself preparing to speak on national news about a hate-fueled attack. She felt a tremor in her fingers and pressed her palms together, recalling a memory of her mother, Miranda, who used to say, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in the face of it." That simple mantra coursed through Ebony's mind, settling her. She glanced at her father for reassurance. James, towering by her side, offered a subtle nod that said, "I believe in you." His presence was an anchor, but she also felt a strange surge of independence, an internal whisper telling her she had the power to shape the narrative from within. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped toward the small barricade set up by airport security. Cameras pivoted and phones lifted in unison, capturing her every movement. A wave of heat prickled across her skin, part nerves and part stage fright. The reporters quieted, forming a near semicircle. Ebony could almost feel their collective anticipation, like a static charge in the air. With a soft clearing of her throat, she began, "I'm Ebony Carter, and a few hours ago I was assaulted on my flight because of my race." She paused, forcing herself to look directly into a few of the cameras, refusing to be timid. "The man who attacked me spilled coffee on me while calling me offensive names. He didn't think I belonged in my seat. He didn't think I deserved the same respect as anyone else." Her voice quavered slightly, but she pressed on. "But here's the truth. My parents taught me that every human being deserves dignity. They told me never to let someone else's hatred rob me of my self-worth. And I want everyone watching to understand that while acts of racism can break our hearts, they don't define our hearts. They don't define us as victims. We define ourselves through our resilience." She remembered the woman on the plane who had recorded the hateful remarks, the flight attendants who offered her dry clothes and comforting words, and the supportive looks from other passengers. Those recollections nourished her courage. "I'm grateful for the people who immediately stood up for me and refused to be bystanders. Their actions showed that there's far more good out there than evil." A hush descended when she finished. No one shouted questions yet. They seemed momentarily disarmed by her poise. But the silence didn't last. Voices rose in a flurry of inquiries. "Ebony, how do you feel about your father being CEO of the airline?" Do you plan to press formal charges? What do you want to say to young people who face racism every day? She swallowed, bracing herself. James stepped closer, gently guiding her away from the barrage. He placed one hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Through her peripheral vision, she spotted the man who attacked her, now encircled by uniformed officers. His frantic gestures and outraged voice were stark contrasts to her own measured composure. A fleeting pang of pity tugged at her. What darkness must reside in someone's heart to hate so easily, she wondered. She turned back to the reporters for one final statement. We'll be cooperating with the police. I believe in justice, and I believe people should be held accountable for hateful actions. But this isn't just about one flight or one person's ignorance. It's about the bigger lesson that we all share a responsibility to call out and confront racism wherever it appears. It's 2025, yet prejudice still finds a way onto our planes, into our schools, and across our streets. That has to change, and it starts with each of us. Security ushered the reporters aside, and James guided Ebony toward the exit, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Though her cheeks burned with adrenaline, she felt a growing calm welling from deep inside. By speaking her truth, even with trembling words, she had taken a stand not just for herself, but for every young person who might feel voiceless when facing bigotry. And in that step, she sensed a spiritual closeness to her mother, a silent affirmation that she was continuing Miranda's legacy of courage, empathy, and unwavering resolve. As Ebony and James left the airport behind, they knew their lives had been irrevocably changed by one hateful act, and by the collective refusal to let that act go unchallenged. In the days that followed, news outlets covered the story extensively. Messages of support poured in from across the globe, and while there were critics as well, Ebony stood firm in her conviction. Shining a light on bigotry was the only way to stop it from festering in the shadows. Today, let Ebony's story remind us that courage, compassion, and accountability can triumph over hatred. If you felt moved, outraged, or inspired by this journey, please show your support, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help amplify the voices of those who refuse to be silenced, and together, we can continue to champion a world where respect and equality rise above ignorance and cruelty. Thank you for watching and standing with us.